Hi, everybody. This is Brendon Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. I'd like to welcome you to this short program. This is my Lost Ship of the Month feature, which I've been doing for, I think the last 6 months now, where I explore using original research a ship that's still missing on the Great Lakes that has never been found. And I go into the ship's history, I go into the history of the accident, and I do original research. In other words, not reading things from books that other people have written, but going right to the sources and trying to find out what we can learn about this now that in the modern computer age with the internet, it's possible oftentimes to unearth new information about where a ship is. So this month's lost ship is the Jennifer. She is a fairly modern steamer lost in 1974 on Lake Michigan. A little bit different from a lot of the ships that I've done in the past because a lot of the people that were involved in this disaster are still alive. Nobody died in this except for the ship. So I'll walk you through a little bit about the ship, a little bit about the accident, and then I'm going to get progressively more and more detailed as we go towards the end. And I'll do some analysis about where I think this ship is and why. And one of the things about this ship you're going to see is that it really illustrates that a modern ship lost in the modern era with a lot of vessels standing by can still be devilishly hard to pin down. So without further ado, the Jennifer. So this vessel was not a traditional Great Lakes vessel. She was actually involved primarily in the East Coast trades up and down the Atlantic seaboard. She was built in 1964 at Lausanne, Quebec by George Davy and Sons. And she was primarily involved in the bulk freight trades. And small, not a big vessel. She was Her registered length is 194 feet. I think overall she was about 200, 210, 36 feet of beam only, and only about 16 feet deep in hold. So not a big vessel to be out on the lakes. She was a steel-hulled vessel, and she was built as the Kokona in 1964, later renamed the Lorna P in 72, and then finally, in her final year, renamed Jennifer. We don't see a lot of pictures of her as the Jennifer, obviously, because she only was around for that one year, but here you see her as the Lorna P, and you get an idea of what she looked like with her cargo boom. High sternhouse, high bow, and kind of a low amidships. Um, Interesting little package freighter, kind of a cute ship. All right. She had a number of owners, passed through the usual, reorganizations of shipping companies. One of the things we find is that the Bowling Green database, which is really the best database for modern ships, has a pretty big error here. They say she was lost 24 miles southwest of Charlevoix, Michigan. That's completely wrong, and you'll see why in a second. But it shows the dangers of going with, only one person's account from a newspaper, and not really doing deeper research. Otherwise, the database is generally really good. It's where I got this data from. So the ship had a couple accidents over her career. She had a fire. She stranded at Bar Harbor, Maine, and had to be fixed. Her hull plating was a little bent, but otherwise, no big deal. So this particular ship came into the Great Lakes because in the early 70s, as many of you know, there was a big trade for in steel, foreign steel, and so she was bringing steel from I think the area around Detour Passage is where she left from, up by Lake Superior down to Milwaukee. We had a number of salties coming in at that time to Kenosha, Racine, Milwaukee, bringing in steel. So I think this was probably European steel. I'm going to talk about a couple of people that are involved in this. You're going to see some names. Captain F. Lewis Muldoon was the captain, or I'm sorry, the pilot, the Great Lakes pilot aboard the Jennifer. Captain Patrick Nugent was the master of register. Many of you know that, due to the Cedarville disaster in 1965, where a foreign flagged vessel had a captain who claimed he didn't, understand the English on the radio. So they passed a ruling that foreign flagged vessels all had to have a Great Lakes pilot on board, even if they were obviously from Canada, because they didn't know the waters. Captain F. Lewis Muldoon was the Great Lakes pilot aboard the Jennifer. Um, and a few other people I'll mention. Captain Michael O'Pack, who was the Great Lakes pilot aboard the foreign flagged vessel Fortuna, who rescued some of the crew. Also, two Coast Guardsmen I'm going to mention who really play a big part in this story, and that's Lieutenant Commander Robin Kraus, who was the helicopter pilot from Glencoe, Illinois, that rescued some of the crew. And then Lieutenant Roger Argalas, the rescue diver who actually went down the line to take some of the men off of the vessel. A lot of these people are still alive and would remember this because it was a really harrowing rescue. So, just to start out at a high level, the Jennifer left. She plotted her course from Sleeping Bear Bay, just inside the Manitous, and was going to take the regular shipping lane straight down to Milwaukee. They knew that there was some bad weather. They were forecasted to have 4 to 8 foot waves with 30-mile-an-hour winds out of the west. And they planned if things got too bad that they could, kind of ease towards the Wisconsin shore and get under the lee of the land if they needed to. Um, they started out on their way, and probably sometime, we don't have the exact time they left from Sleeping Bear Bay because it's not a port. They just, that's where they made their turn. But probably sometime in the evening of the 30th of December. The next thing we hear from them is at 23:30, so 11:30 at night. They are, roughly somewhere just south of Sheboygan when they take two sudden 40-degree rolls, and the seas had been building. They weren't 48 footers, they were 8 to 12 footers, as it turned, with the occasional 15, 16 footer. And you can imagine that's high as this vessel's hull. Um, they were really worried about it because this vessel was known to roll. Um, at 23:50, so just 20 minutes later, they took a real big wave, and the boat did not recover back to vertical. It maintained a 22-degree list. Um, they heard a large crash when this happened, and they knew that their cargo of steel rails or steel billets, as it were, had shifted. And the captain and the pilot even mentioned that they didn't think it was packed. It was stacked well down there. The ship behaved out of the ordinary. Um, it was not recovering well. They felt like things were moving. And so they were worried about the crash. They assumed that they were in trouble, and immediately they called for the Coast Guard and sent out a mayday. Um, at 2400, the ship was no longer able to, or at midnight, was no longer able to maintain steerage. Because her propeller and her rudder didn't have enough bite in the water, and so they 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 put the rudder hard to side and tried to head the vessel into the wind. So they were, instead of heading towards Milwaukee, they were heading more towards the Port Washington area, more towards shore. Um, a number of vessels heard their mayday. The Great Lakes carrier Venus and two foreign flagged vessels, the Fortuna and the Monte Zaraza, a Spanish flagged vessel, all heard their call. At the same time, the Coast Guard dispatched a number of vessels. The Milwaukee station dispatched their 44-foot rescue vessel. A helicopter was dispatched from Glenview, Illinois. A Coast Guard cutter was dispatched from Grand Haven. Another cutter was dispatched from Sturgeon Bay. And so we had a lot of vessels all converging on the location. So by 3:30 in the morning, so roughly 3.5 hours after all the calls went out, the first vessels on the site were the Fortuna, and the Venus arrived very shortly thereafter. And the Fortuna pulled up alongside while the Venus trained her lights on the vessel. Oh, just about an hour later, 0420, the first Coast Guard helicopter arrives and removed four of the crew. Now, the people on the vessel were really getting nervous at this time because she was starting to really go down. Her decks were starting to get awash, um, and her stern was starting to be underwater. They were gathered on the front of the bow. The rescue man on the helicopter, Lieutenant Roger Argalis, had a real hard time because of all the mast of the ship, and the vessel was rolling so precariously. And if you saw those pictures, she had those high masts and booms, and it was thrashing around at the rescue line, and so he had a really tough time. By the time they got four people out of the 15 crew onto that helicopter, the vessel, uh, you know, it was deemed too dangerous to go any further. Now the captain and the crew were really upset. They felt that the helicopter should have transferred the men to the Fortuna or to the Venus instead of just taking four people and running back to Milwaukee. But they were running dangerously low on fuel. It was taking a lot of fuel to keep that helicopter in place and to battle the 40-mile-an-hour winds. And so it really was a very difficult rescue, one of the most difficult rescues they had ever done. Um, so the crew is left, and the helicopter is gone. Um, at 0430, the vessel Monte Zazara arrived and also was standing by. They were waiting for that helicopter to return. The helicopter had radioed that they would be back after they refueled. Um, the helicopter still wasn't there at 5:40 in the morning when the ship really started to wallow and they were in fear for their life. So Captain Muldoon and Captain Nugent launched a lifeboat. Most of the crew got in the lifeboat, but Captain Muldoon actually ended up in the lake. It was 30 degrees out. There was a heck of a wind chill. They were in, 10 to 15 footers. Muldoon's lucky he lived. It was a heck of a rescue. They finally got him to the raft. The Fortuna had a real hard time coming alongside that raft in those huge seas. They would try to get in the lee of the vessel, but every time they'd have to, make another pass, and it took them a good long time. So the crew got in the water at 0540. Um, the Jennifer plunged at 0550. 10 minutes after they abandoned, the Jennifer went to the bottom. Um, the rescue took another 55 minutes before all 11 crew were taken aboard the Fortuna. So these guys had a real harrowing time. Their lives were definitely in danger. They're out in 15 footers in a rescue raft. Now, mind you, the crew had practiced these drills. They knew how to do it, but the weather was awful, and they didn't know that if the helicopters would make it back. So they got on board the Fortuna. The Fortuna eventually took them all to Port Huron. So that's the basic story. But let's dig in a little deeper and see if we can find out some more information. So here's the picture we have of the um, Jennifer under her own name. Now, a couple of things we start to find out about this disaster as the articles progress in the newspapers. Um, uh, Captain Muldoon was a pretty colorful character. He started to tell his story, and he had a logbook that he kept while he was out there, which is really interesting. Um, he had high praise for the crew of the Fortuna, who really had to do some masterful maneuvering to pick them up. And that Great Lakes pilot on the Fortuna, Captain Michael Opack, was just an apprentice pilot. It was his first gig, and he did a wonderful job of coming around and rescuing these guys in really big seas. So a lot of praise there. Um, we start to get into the fact that Muldoon had his logbook with him, which was pretty detailed about times and about what really happened. Um, he chalked up his survival to Irish luck, but Captain Lieutenant Commander Krause from the Coast Guard and Lieutenant Argalis, I think really played a big part in the rescue, and they also kept really detailed records, which is interesting. So most of the early accounts said that the vessel was 20 miles northeast of Milwaukee when it went down, and that came largely from the crew, uh, who frankly didn't have a good idea where they were. They didn't know how far it was yet to Milwaukee. They knew how far they'd been sailing, but they couldn't see shore. It was, the middle of the night. So Captain Muldoon, he's interviewing with the reporter and he says, "Here, please look at this," Muldoon said as he handed me a handwritten log of the events aboard the Jennifer just prior to her sinking. So I just gave you the time rundown. You know, Muldoon, though, said in the end that he felt that she sank in 50 fathoms, approximately 50 miles, 40 degrees from Milwaukee. Um, at 6:45, everybody had been rescued. So although Muldoon gives an excellent account of blow by blow of what happened out there on the boat, minute by minute, and gave some great dramatic interviews. His accounts, I think, reflect what he was able to know, and one of those things was not exactly where they were. Now, the crew, that was taken off by the helicopter all gave pretty good interviews and had high praise for the Coast Guardsmen. The 44-foot rescue boat from Milwaukee, by the way, had to turn back because it was so rough out there. Um, they couldn't even make it. They got, just off Milwaukee and they turned back. They also had dispatched the Coast Guard icebreaker Westwind up there, and they actually spent some time looking to make sure that the ship had truly sunk and wasn't a hazard to navigation. Um, so we got a couple other interesting accounts. Argalis, the rescue diver, mentioned that he went to the scene after the ship went down and cited quite a bit of debris as well as an oil slick on the site. But the Coast Guard spokesman just said it wouldn't be possible to salvage it due to the depth, which makes sense. And you're going to see that. You're going to see why later. Probably the most important smoking gun we've got, though, is this account that came really heavily from Lieutenant Argalis and from Lieutenant Commander Robin Kraus, the helicopter pilot. And this is a letter that was published by the meteorology journal in Mariner's Weather Log. And it comes from the weather station in Cleveland. And they got this report directly from the Coast Guard. And this is an actual synoptic weather map of the conditions at the time that Jennifer went down. And I like this because it says, waves 48 feet were forecast. Um, but it actually got, much worse pretty quickly. And one of the things we get out of this article that's really sort of useful is some distances about where this ship went down. What he says is um, the vessel was just 38 miles from Milwaukee, 21 miles south-southeast of Sheboygan, and 21 miles east-northeast of Port Washington. Um, what's interesting about that is the specificity with which they give those distances. This came from the Coast Guard, who had flown from Milwaukee to the site. They knew how far it was from Milwaukee, and I had pretty good estimates, I think, of how far they were from the other places. This also makes sense with respect to some of the other data that's given. So, as I go through the articles, one of the things that I noticed, first of all, is that they had to be on the course line from Sleeping Bear Bay. And they mentioned that if it got too rough, they were going to try to cleave to the western shore, but they never said it did. They said they didn't get in any trouble until it really happened suddenly. Things felt pretty good until they started rolling and the steel shifted just a few minutes later. So they never did do that turn to the shore. But we can see the course line. This is the course line they were definitely on. So let's come on down and take a look at the analysis of where we think they might have been. We have a few different accounts. We have Muldoon's account that says they were 50 miles northeast of Milwaukee. We've got the newspaper accounts that say they were variously 20 miles and 31 miles northeast of Milwaukee. But then we have these accounts from the Coast Guard, which say that they were 38 miles from Milwaukee, 21 miles east-northeast of Port Washington, and 21 miles south-southeast of Sheboygan. If you pin those and put them right on that course line, they match up nicely, right? So they gave three different vectors that all kind of match up. And that's right here off of this little point just north of Port Washington, right? In this nice little box area. Um, so I'm inclined to believe this account from the Coast Guard, who probably knew how far they were flying. They were worried about their fuel consumption. I think they had pretty good information. Let's look at the bottom of the lake. So we know that if you're doing that course line to Milwaukee out of Sleeping Bear Bay and you're coming off that area, guess what you're passing through? You're passing through what is known as the Milwaukee Basin. And so here we have the Milwaukee Basin, and we have this exact area where I drew the box. Lo and behold, they go right over the deepest part, which is 150 fathom. And that is exactly the depth that's given in most of the newspaper accounts, 450 feet of water. And one wonders, they probably did have a depth sounder in 1974. Certainly, Vexilar was available, and they would have known how deep the water was, I think. And so I suspect that they are in this area right here. Now, is this easy to find? No. This is far from shore, quite a ways out. It's very deep. And this is a big grid. We're talking about a grid here that, because they turned into the waves and kept their engine running, they probably weren't exactly on this line. They may be a little bit west of it, but um, we don't know, exactly how far they were. It's probably about I'd say at least a 5 mile by 5 mile grid, so 25 miles on the lucky side. On the unlucky side, it's a 8 by 10, maybe 80 square miles. So difficult to find. You'd need a pretty good big game hunting sonar to go out there and find it. Probably a 50 kilohertz, 150 kilohertz, and you'd have to have some money because the gas to get out there from Port Washington or from Sheboygan costs a lot. So the Jennifer probably won't be found anytime soon, although I do suspect she will be found. I think all vessels that are lost on the Great Lakes will be found eventually because of the availability of magnetic anomaly data, the advent of autonomous underwater vehicles that are doing higher resolution mapping of the lake bottom. So this vessel will be found, and it's got quite a harrowing story behind it. And as I said, many of these people that survived this are still alive. They were young men at the time. So hopefully some of them see this and can share some of their remembrances of this. I'd be interested in hearing from Lieutenant Argalis if he's still interested in chatting about this because it was quite a rescue, and I know he's still alive, as well as many of the young men who were rescued from the ship. So thank you very much for watching, and I feel free to post your comments in the Facebook chat about this. And stay tuned for more Lost Ships of the Month, where I explore each month a new ship still missing on the Great Lakes, and I take you on a deep dive through her history. Thanks so much for watching.